Here's a little trick when you want a function to return a Boolean, a true or false value. You can see in this function, we're checking if A is less than B, and if so, we return true, else we return false. You may remember from before that all comparison operators return a Boolean true or false value. So instead of using this if statement here, we can just do that. We can actually delete all of this and just return the result of this. We're just returning the result of A is less than B. So this is going to be true or false, and we can just skip that whole if statement logic and just return this. So if we console.log this out, console.log, we should be able to see if 10 is less than 15. 10 is less than 15, it's true. But if we put a 20 here, then it's false. We've already seen a few examples of this, but you can return early from a function with the return statement. So if you see this function right here, we return at the very end of the function, and so it leaves the function and returns this value from the function. But you can leave the function anytime with a return statement. So we're going to modify this function so that if A or B are less than 0, the function will immediately exit with a value of undefined. So let's do that. We're going to set an if statement. If A is less than 0, or that's two pipes, B is less than 0, then we're going to return undefined. So we can do a test here, console.log 8, but what if this is a negative number? It's going to return undefined. Scrimba has a little quirk here where it just shows null, but in a browser it will show undefined. We are going to create a blackjack card counting function. So how card counting works, at least how this function is going to work, is that when you see a low card, the count goes up, and when you see a high card, the count goes down, and if it's a middle value card, the count stays the same. And then when the count is positive, the player should bet high. And when the count is 0 or negative, the player should bet low. So we are going to use a switch statement to figure out what card has been passed in and what to do about it. You can see that the function looks like this: CC, and we pass in a card. And depending on what the card is, it's going to increase this global count variable, or it's going to decrease it, or it's going to stay the same. And then we are going to return two things. We're not going to return change me. We are going to return the current count value and whether the player should hold or bet. So every time you call the CC function, it's going to change this count value and return the total count. So let's see how this is going to work. We are going to use the switch statement, like I said, and we're going to check the card value that was passed in. So if the case is 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, we are going to increment the count variable. So we're going to do it like this: case 2. I'm going to do some copying and pasting. If the case is 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, we'll just have to actually change these values. 3, 4, 5, 6. Now, there are many ways to write any program. This could be done with if statements and else statements. It could be even done with other ways that we haven't even talked about yet. As long as the program works, in this case, that's all that matters. So if you find a different way to write this program, that's great. So if the case is 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6, we are going to take the count value, and if we just do plus plus, that increments it by 1, and then we're going to break. Now, if the case is 7, 8, 9, So let's paste in 3 of these. We'll do 7, 8, 9. Actually, we're going to do nothing. Uh, the count is not going to change at all. So we don't even need case 7 or 8, 9. So instead of doing 7, 8, 9, we just need to check in the case that something's actually going to happen. So we are going to decrement the count variable if we have 10, jack, queen, king, or ace. So that's what we're going to change this to. 10, jack, queen, king, or ace. In this case, we're going to decrement the count. So we can do count minus minus. So that's the same as count equals count minus 1. And then we will break. Now we've taken care of the count and updating the count. Now we have to take care of what we're going to return. We are going to return the count, and we're also going to return whether we are going to hold or bet. So we're going to actually return a variable, but first there's going to be a space. There's a space between the number, and then we're going to return the hold bet variable. Now this is a variable we haven't created yet. Normally this would be the perfect time to use the ternary operator, but we haven't learned that yet, and we're not going to learn that for a few more lessons, so I won't use that now. We are going to set what that hold bet value is. First, we'll create the hold bet variable hold bet, and we'll set it to hold. However, if count is more than 0, then we can set hold bet to equal bet. So now this should work. Let's test it out and see if we've made any mistakes yet. Hold bet is not defined. Well, we have it right here. Hold. Oh, we spelled that wrong. So instead of halt bet, that should be hold bet. Okay, in this case, we're going to bet because we had a bunch of positive numbers and then negative numbers. But if we change this to k, and we change this to 10, let's see what happens. Now we're going to hold. Okay, it worked. Objects! Objects are similar to arrays, except that instead of using indexes to access data, you use properties. So here's an object called our dog. Objects are going to be defined with these curly braces at the beginning and the end, and these are the properties. Now, the properties are everything before the colons. So we have name, that's a property, legs is a property, and then the values are the things after the colons here. So the name is camper, the legs 4, tails, there's only one tail on this dog, and friends are everything. Now you can see that with the properties can be strings, they can be numbers, they can be arrays, they can be any data type in JavaScript. So now we are going to create our own dog. So this is going to have a name. Personally, I like the name Quincy. So we'll use that for our dog's name. Also, we're going to have legs. Unfortunately, our dog has had an accident. He only has 3 legs. But to make up for the only having 3 legs, he does have 2 tails. And for friends, another unfortunate thing, it's an empty array. He has no friends. Okay, we've now created our own object. There are 2 main ways to access a property on an object. The first I will talk about is dot notation. So we have this test object, and we have hat, shirt, and shoes, and we want to find out the value of these properties. So right here, the hat value, we're going to set to test object. Now here's where we use the dot notation. We just put a dot or a period, and then I put the name of the property, dot hat. And then for the shirt value, I will do dot shirt. So see, this word right here is just the word here. So the value of hat value, test object dot hat, is now going to be ball cap, and the value of the shirt value is going to be jersey. Besides using dot notation, you can also use bracket notation to access a property in an object. You can use bracket notation anytime, but it is required if the name has a space in it. You can see in this object we have three properties and each of them have a space. So to get the value of these properties, we're going to have to use bracket notation. So the entree value, we're going to do test object, that's the name of the object, and then we're going to put brackets kind of like an array index. So you need the opening and closing brackets, and inside we will put the name of the property. So I'll do an entree, and then we can do it again down here for the drink value, and I'll use a single quote this time instead of a double quote to show that each of those will work. The drink, and then we need the closing brackets here. So now entree value is set to equal hamburger, and drink value is set to equal water. Bracket notation can also be used to look up object properties using variables. So here we have this test object. We have these different numbers associated with these names here. And we are going to set this variable to be one of the numbers. So I'll set this to be 16. So now we can, in this test object, 16 is Montana, and we can look that up using the variable name instead of the number. So instead of putting 16, I'm going to put player number in here. And now player is set to the word, the string, Montana, and we use this variable to look up the object property. We can use dot notation to update object properties. Here you can see an object called our dog. It has a name, legs, tails, friends, and the name is Camper. However, here we use dot notation rdog.name and use the assignment operator, the equal sign, to set the name to happy camper. So if we did console.log on rdog.name, it would no longer be camper, it would be happy camper. Well, we have another dog here with the name of Coder, but we want to change the name to happy Coder. So that's what I'll do right here. So my dog.name equals happy coder. So just like above, we use dot notation to set the object property to a new value. You can add new properties to an object using dot notation or bracket notation. So here's an example right here. We have this object, our dog, and there's four properties here. But down here, we're adding a new property. Our dog.bark equals bow wow. So it had four properties, but now it has five properties as the property bark as well. Now down here, we'll add a property to the my dog object. So we can do my dog, and then here I'm going to use bracket notation instead of dot notation. Bark, I'm going to set that to equal woof. And because he's yelling it, we'll have an exclamation point. And that's how you add properties to objects. It's simple to delete a property from an object. Our rdog object has all these properties, and with the delete keyword, delete rdog.bark. So now this property here, the bark, has been deleted and is no longer in the object after we've deleted it. So we can do the same thing down here. And this time, we will delete the tails property, mydog.tails. So now the mydog object no longer has a tails property. Objects can be thought of as a key value storage like a dictionary. you can use an object to look up values. So in this case, we have a switch statement that returns certain values. So when you pass in alpha to the function, it returns atoms. If you pass in Bravo, it returns Boston. We can replace this switch statement with an object and use the object for lookups instead of the switch statement. Let me show you how that's done. I'm going to create var lookup. This is going to be an object here, and the object is going to have a bunch of key value pairs. So we have alpha, and that's going to be atoms. And then we have Bravo, and the value for Bravo is going to be Boston. And that's it. So we can now delete this whole switch statement, and now we can say result equals lookup. In bracket notation, we put the value that was passed in. And then I forgot one thing, which was the equal sign here, because lookup equals this object. And let's do a test. So let me put console.log so we can actually see what happens here. So if we do Charlie, we're going to get Chicago. If we do Foxtrot, the result will be Frank. So it works. You can check if an object has a property with the hasOwnProperty method. Let me show you how to use this method and finish making this function where we check if an object has a specific property. If it doesn't have the property, we'll return not found. So let me show you how that's going to work. We'll do myObj, that's the object up above, dot hasOwnProperty, and then we pass in the property we're going to check, which is check prop. This is either going to come back as true or false if it has the property. So let's make this into an if statement. If my object has its own property, check prop. But if that's true, we're going to return my object and then use bracket notation, check prop. So we're going to return the value of that property. Else, we're going to return not found. So let's take off this other return statement, and I'll do a test. So when we pass in gift here, we returned pony. But let's say we passed in hello. Below that, not found. Okay, it works. A JavaScript object is a way to store flexible data. So you can store strings, numbers, and arrays, and even other objects. So in this example, we have an array called myMusic. We can see it's an array because we have the open bracket and close bracket, but inside the array are objects. So this is one of the objects, and inside the objects are all these key value pairs with the strings and the numbers and so on. So I'm going to add another object. So since this is an array, after each element in an array, you have to have a comma. So I'm going to add a comma here. And then I'm going to add my next record right below this comment here. And we're going to have, just like above, we're going to have an artist. The artist is going to be Bo Carnes. And then we have a title. The title will be Serial Man. The release year will be 2003. And for formats, this is going to be an array, just like above. So we can have any format. I'm going to put YouTube video. And now we've created a second object in our myMusic array. And each object holds data in a property, which is the key value format. This is very similar to JSON, which we will talk more about later. Here we have an object with other objects nested inside that. So in order to access subproperties of an object, you can chain together the dot or bracket notation. So I'm trying to get the glove box contents. So I'm going to take away this undefined here, and I'll do my storage dot car dot inside. And then now the next thing, we did car inside. The last thing is glove box. Because there's a space here, we have to use bracket notation. So I'm going to use bracket notation on the end here and say glove box. And now if we run this, see, we are going to console.log. So let's see if we get the contents here. Yep, maps. It worked. Array bracket notation can be changed to access nested arrays. You can see we have this array here, and inside this array are two objects. The first element in the array is this object. The second element in the array is this object. And then inside the object, we have a key value pair. The key is list, and the value is another array here. So we can combine dot notation and bracket notation to access the second tree. That's what we're trying to do here. So let's do that. First, we need to do my plants, and the trees are the second element in the my plants array, which is index 1. Now we need to get the list. So the list of trees here. So I'm going to do dot list. And since dot list is an array, I can use the bracket notation to get the second list element, which again is array index 1. So if we run this, it's going to console.log, and we see pine. That's the second tree here. This is a coding challenge we're going to do. We're given this object here, which is a record collection. Each record has an ID, and then it also has different pieces of information about the record. They don't all have the same information, but see, we have album, artist, tracks, album, artist, tracks. This just says artist, tracks, and this just has album here. And we are supposed to create this update records function where we can pass in the ID, the property, and the value, and it's going to update our record collection with the property and the value. So for instance, if we pass in the ID 2468 and we put the property artist, and if we set a different value like Quincy or something like that, then we should update this whole object so now it says Quincy instead of Prince. And we should return the full collection. So it's going to update the collection and then return the collection. If we have an empty string for the value, it should just completely delete that property. Also, if we have the property of tracks and then we have a value, instead of updating the whole tracks here with what we put in, it's just going to add the track to the end of this array. So if you look right here, it says, the comment says, keep a copy of the collection for tests. This JSON.parse and JSON.stringify and then collection, this is just a fancy way in JavaScript to make a copy of the object. Remember, in our function, we are going to be changing the collection object, but we want to have a copy of the original object before anything was changed. So that's what that's for. So let's go ahead and do that. So we're just updating this function here, this update records function. Okay, so let's get to this. So we'll do if value equals blank, because the first condition we are going to test for is if we need to delete the property. Remember, if the value is set to blank, we delete that property. So if the value is blank, we are going to delete collection, and then we have to use bracket notation, ID, and then prop. The collection ID prop, that's the collection here. If we pass in the ID 1248, it would go to there. The property, if we pass in album for the property, it would go to here, and then it would just delete that whole thing if our value is an empty string. Okay, the next condition we have to look for is if the property is tracks. Because for most properties, we're just going to override that property with the value passed into the function. But if the property is tracks, we are going to push onto the end of the array. So let's do an else if. Else if prop equals tracks, then we just have to push onto the end of the array. So there's also another condition here, which is if the tracks property is empty. If the tracks property is empty, we need to create it. Here's a fancy way to do that. Collection ID props. So if prop equals tracks, we are going to set the tracks, because remember prop is going to equal tracks. We're going to set the tracks to equal. It's going to either equal itself if it exists, or if it doesn't exist, we're going to create it. I'll show you how. Collection ID prop. It's going to equal itself, or that's the or operator. It's going to equal an empty array. So if this already exists, we're going to set it to equal itself. But if itself doesn't exist, we'll just set it to equal an empty array. So that's just a way to create that property if it doesn't already exist. So now that we know it exists, we can just push the value to the end of the array. Collection ID prop, and we'll just do the dot push and then put in the parentheses the value. So we're able to push the value that was passed into this function onto the end of the array. Okay, there's only one last condition, which is the kind of the default condition, else. So if the value isn't blank and the property isn't tracks, then we just push the value onto the property. Then we just set the property to equal the value, just like this. Collection ID prop equals value. Okay, let's test this out. So we already have this example down here, but to see if it actually worked, we're going to do a console.log so we can see the output there. And if I run that, let me open up the console so we can really see it. So let's see what we changed. Go to 5439, and we set the artist, which didn't previously exist, to ABBA. So let's look down here. In the console, 5439, and the artist is ABBA. Let's see what happens when we add a track. So we'll do one more example here. I'll just put it right above here. Update records. And I'm going to pass in something. I'll pass in, let's see, the ID 2468. And we'll pass in the key, which is going to be tracks. And then for the value, we'll put test. So let's see what happens here. If we run that, it's going to update the record here, and then it's going to update the record again, but we don't care about that one. We mainly care that it's going to console.log what the final value is. So if we look at 2468 here, 2468, let's see the tracks. We got 1999, Little Red Corvette, and test. So it's working. Great.